Hello, and welcome to this roundtable discussion. I'm Aminda Smith, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session, which is titled Revisiting the Revolution, Engaging Chinese Scholarship Through Collaborative Translations. Of course, we all wish that we could be together and with you in person, but we're still very happy to be able to present this roundtable. And we're very grateful to you for choosing to watch this recorded session. We welcome and look forward to your questions and comments. Our speakers today are all participants in an exciting and innovative project developed by Timothy Cheek, David Ownby, and Joshua Fogel. The project seeks to translate and engage with cutting-edge research in Chinese on the Chinese Revolution to highlight significant contributions and to discuss the ways that Chinese scholarship resonates with and poses challenges to the Anglophone scholarship. And while the products of this process are certainly of great interest to other scholars, the project also frames this work so that it can speak to a broader audience of people interested in learning more about intellectual currents in China more generally. And to do this important work, the larger project has a number of different components, but the speakers who are here today are exploring and innovating methodologies relating to mapping of intellectual fields through collaborative translation and the co-production of knowledge and analysis. At the core of the praxis are working pairs of graduate students and junior faculty, one Anglophone, one Sinophone, and each of our panelists today represent one half of such a pair. And they're going to talk about their experiences, after which I will offer a few very brief comments and questions, and then our speakers will have a chance to respond. And again, we're all looking forward to your comments and questions as well. All right, let's turn to our first panelist, Yifan Shi, who is a PhD candidate in history at Simon Fraser University.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this roundtable discussion to share with you some thoughts from me and Jonathan Henshaw, who is now a postdoc researcher at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. We began our collaborative translation by coming up with a practical definition of new revolutionary history. For us, there are two most pressing questions when selecting text to be translated. First, what can be considered new in new revolutionary history? And second, which revolution or revolutions should be covered in new revolutionary history? We started our mapping by looking at the writings of Chinese scholars on their understandings of this issue. In one article published in November 2019, Chinese scholar Li Lifeng tries to make sense of the definition of new revolutionary history. According to the author, this notion has at least 6 features. First, contrary to the official revolutionary narrative that is used for political propaganda, the new revolutionary history is academic-oriented, meaning that it conducts academic studies by collecting and interpreting primary sources. Second, topics of the new revolutionary history are diverse, including political history, economic history, social history, cultural history, and intellectual history. Third, instead of regarding elites as major historical actors, new revolutionary history wants to uncover more grassroots voices to show the mechanism of the Chinese Revolution. Fourth, although the Chinese Communist Revolution is still under the spotlight, advocates of the new revolutionary history strive to put the Communist Revolution under the context of the entire modern Chinese history. Fifth, while the geographical focus of the traditional revolutionary history tends to be within the Chinese border, the new revolutionary history wishes to provide a transnational picture of the Chinese Revolution. Sixth, new revolutionary history adopts concepts, theories, and methods from other disciplines, including but not limited to political science, sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies. It is noteworthy that after comparing the traditional revolutionary history and the new revolutionary history, Li Lifeng concludes that it is difficult and necessary to give a very clear and integral definition of new revolutionary history. For him, traditional revolutionary history and new revolutionary history are not mutually exclusive in the sense that both focus on the topic of revolution. In other words, as a scholarly trend generated from a very special condition, meaning that there is an authoritarian regime promoting a correct historical narrative, new revolutionary history only tries to complicate the oversimplified picture painted by the official narrative endorsed by the Chinese Communist Party. It is far from facilitating a paradigm shift. Although the new revolutionary history might have provided some new knowledge, the term itself does not indicate a new approach. It means grafting existing approaches to the studies of the Chinese Revolution. While this might be a new practice for scholars from mainland China, for those studying the Chinese Revolution outside China, the methodological implication of new revolutionary history might be less impressive because combining approaches from other fields with the studies of modern China is exactly what they have been doing. So back to the question, what is new in new revolutionary history? There will be too many to choose from if we only try to find articles providing something different from the traditional historical narrative. After all, nowadays, almost everyone will argue that they have something new in their articles. Otherwise, their articles will not be published at all. Therefore, we consider new revolutionary history as an academic trend that offers new perspectives or new approaches with long-lasting influence, or at least can attract some scholarly attention. This requires a self-consciousness of using a different perspective or approach, or as Chinese scholars usually say, 理论自觉, in their own articles. These perspectives and approaches should be sustainable in the sense that other scholars may also follow these perspectives and approaches to do their own research. A good indicator of sustainability might be how many times they have been cited. In this regard, we will not see articles just providing some new historical facts as examples of new revolutionary history. Here, the introduction of new perspectives is more important. Another practical issue when selecting texts is which revolution or revolutions should be covered in new revolutionary history. As Li Lifeng points out in his article, when scholars talk about new revolutionary history, they are usually referring to historical studies on the Chinese Communist Revolution before 1949, although they will put that revolution under a broader temporal or spatial context. However, in the list of recommended essays provided by 7 Chinese scholars, including Li Lifeng, Tang Xiaobing, Zhao Nuo, Liu Yajuan, Jiang Lingnan, He Yiming, and Ren Wei, we have found that articles about topics other than the Chinese Communist Revolution are also included. This fact indicates that scholars haven't reached a consensus on the scope of new revolutionary history. Although the Chinese Communist Revolution is always on the center stage, scholars do not refuse to include academic research on other revolutions, from the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 to the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. To sum up, when selecting texts, we use the following practical definition of new revolutionary history. Articles that combine revolutions in China's 20th century with important new approaches, and there should be some indication that they have had a certain degree of academic impact. These new approaches might include new cultural history, organizational history, history of emotions, history of the body, and other methods from other fields such as social sciences. Based on these criteria, we chose Li Gongzhong's article on the making of Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum as the first text to be translated. Li Gongzhong is now a professor at Nanjing University, and this article was first published in 2006. In 2009, his monograph of the same title was published, and it was reprinted in 2019, which indicates the long-lasting influence of his work. Li Gongzhong's article argues that similar to the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial in the United States, the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum is also a public symbol with strong modern political and cultural connotations. The construction of the mausoleum embodies the KMT's efforts to shape the collective memory, to create a new political symbol, and to promote the identity of the Chinese nation state. Apparently, Li's article is an example that combines the approach of new cultural history with the study of the nationalist revolution. Most importantly, Li has a strong self-consciousness to engage previous studies on the history of political culture, including studies of political symbols, political rituals, architecture, and images. We believe that through the translation of this article, we can show how the cultural turn has made substantial impact on the study of the Chinese Revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ma Nan, who is an assistant professor in the School of Marxism at Shanghai Jiao Tong University.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers to invite me to join the roundtable discussion. Now, I'd like to briefly talk about the situation in China's historical circles. The so-called the new revolutionary history is actually directed against the old revolutionary narrative since the founding of the PRC. There's no doubt that the old narrative is political propaganda, not real history. What the new one does to bring the history back to the academic track. The topic of our discussion, revisiting the revolution, actually means the same thing. But how to return to the academic track? Professor Wang Qishen at Peking University believes that it is necessary to put all parties or groups in the same historical field to reproduce the complex aspects of the revolution. Professor Zhang Jishun at East China Normal University thinks that it is necessary to show the triple narrative of revolution, state, and society. Well, the two most important advocates of the new revolutionary history are Professor Li Jingzhen at Nankai University and Professor Ying Xin at Tsinghua University. The former thinks that the study of revolution should tap the subjectivity of grassroots society and ordinary people. Well, the latter directly use sociological and anthropological methods to study Chinese Revolution. Matt Galway, an assistant professor at the University of Melbourne, and I translate an article by Ying Xin. From the perspective of sociology, this paper discusses the unique new relationship between the army and the local areas created by the First Red Army led by Mao Zedong, the First Red Army of the CPC. On the border of Jiangxi and Fujian province from 1927 to 1930, Ying Xin named this relationship as military localization. The scholars mentioned above are all important scholars. However, to some extent, although the proposition was put forward by these scholars, perhaps they play a more prejudged role, the Chinese name Yu Liu. At present, a large number of studies on this area in China are mostly the students of these scholars. This involves intergenerational issues in Chinese academic circle. Zhang Jishun, Wang Qishen, and Li Jingzhen, Ying Xin, these top scholars in China were born in 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Their early years were deeply influenced by the revolutionary culture of Mao era. The narrative of the old revolutionary history was naturally an important part of their knowledge structure. It can be said that the academic ambition of their generation is to break the myth of the old narrative, to enter the historical scene and try to restore the daily logic and normal behavior of figures, groups, and common people. It's just a revolutionary academic breakthrough for them. The new generation researchers are mostly born in the 1980s and the 1990s. Compared with their teachers, they can naturally treat the revolution with an ordinary mind because they never took part in the revolution. Revolution is naturally objectified to them. Compared with their teachers who lost learning opportunities in their early years, the new generation learning experience was very complete. They grow up under globalization, learned the latest methods of politics, sociology, and anthropology, and have good language training so they can see more first-hand historical materials. Some of these young scholars have already had mature academic works, which in fact deserve our more attention. For example, Xi Xiaoling's book, Being a Soldier, showed how the peasants in North China under the leadership of the CPC went to the battlefield. Through his research, we can see how tradition, countryside, revolution, and war crisscross on ordinary people. Zhao Nuo, a student of Yang Huisong, studied the relationship between outside cadres and local cadres in the base of the 8th Route Army during the anti-Japanese War. He Zhiming studied the relationship between southward cadres and the local cadres in southern province of China after the founding of the PRC. Meng Qingyan, a student of Yingxin, uses concept of micro-mechanism to describe the Chinese Revolution, while Liu Yazhen, a student of Zhang Jishun, shows the modern side of Shanghai, a city of the PRC in the So the research of these young scholars is very innovative from many new angles to explore the political culture and organizational mechanism of the CPC. In addition, Chinese academic journals such as 中共党史研究 and 抗日战争研究 have also opened up columns for young scholars whose paper can reflect the theme of the new revolutionary history, which also encourages more and more young scholars to devote themselves to this area. As far as I know, Nankai University has gathered a group of young scholars. They call their research North China Studies. They take the advantage of North China as a crisscross zone of the CPC, Yanxishan, Chiang Kai-shek, and Japan during 1930s to 1940s, experimenting with the new methods. However, the new revolutionary history is not a paradigm shift in the circle of modern Chinese history. Rather than regarding it as a revolution, it is better to regard it as an academic activity advocated by famous Chinese scholars and participated by the post-80s and post-90s scholars. This academic activity aims to bring the research of revolution in the 20th century back to the academic track, so as to make China's research dialogue with the world's Chinese studies. We should truly realize that it is a reflection of the scholarship is a public property of the world. The Chinese name 学术乃天下之公器. This may be the significance of the new revolutionary history and revisiting the revolution. Okay.
Thank you very much. Our third panelist is Wang Wenjie, who is a MA candidate at the University of British Columbia.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to give you a presentation of mapping Taiwanese scholarship on New Revolutionary History that I did for our collaborative translation, and which I call that the geographic scoop, a geographical mapping of New Revolutionary History. And as a matter of fact, how to situate Taiwan in this bigger picture, bigger map of New Revolutionary History is not a self-evident question, since this is a historiography first raised by mainland scholars, as we mentioned. So Taiwanese scholarship occupies a very ambiguous position in it, given the long separationism between China and Taiwan. But as a translation group based in Western academia, we try to go beyond the separationism and think about the possibility of weakening it under the historiography of New Revolutionary History. So this presentation tries to provide a new interpretation of this term, and I will try to reflect on this definition under the context of Cold War and to see how this framework contributes to a broader picture of New Revolutionary History. Next slide, please. I will start from mainland scholar Li Jingzhen's very first definition. And from his definition, we can see that this is a historiography born out of China's depoliticized and de-revolutionized reform period. And he called for using common sense, common feelings, and common reason to review the communist revolution in a sincerely historical sense, instead of being a servant of politics or eulogy of revolution that dominated by the narrative of unshakable success and leadership wisdom. And starting from Li's basic definition, I would like to give a very brief review of the historiography of communist revolution in Taiwan from the 1950s to contemporary period, from which we'll see that to use common sense to review the communist revolution is not just a challenge for the mainland historians who were free from the narrative of victory, but also for the Taiwanese counterparts who have been stifled by the Cold War anti-communist ideology. Next slide, please. Taiwan has a long history of studying the communist revolution, but before China conducted the reform in Taiwan, started democratization in the 1980s, this was also a highly ideologized field and had a pejorative name of bandit studies. And bandit was also the name that frequently used by Taiwanese scholars at this period to refer to Mao and other CCP leaders. And the study of the Chinese Communist Party was monopolized by the Research Center for International Relations at National Chengchi University, which was adapted from an intelligence agency of the nationalist government in the 1960s, when the United States sought for materials and information about the closed People's Republic. Since Taiwan had become the ideal site of information, Chiang Kai-shek regarded that this was a good chance to use academic research as a form of propaganda to influence policymaking of the Western countries and to project the image of the authentic China or the liberal China. During this period, historians of communist history served as this institution to help train anti-communist intellectuals, and most representatively Guo Qian, who was a former CCP member of the Southern Bureau, but later converted to the nationalists and retreated to Taiwan. Next slide. But this ice cold situation started to melt after China's reform and crucially Taiwan's democratization at the same period, especially in the 1990s when the Cold War came to the end. This research center gradually normalized as the Institute of Social Science, and the research of communist China decentralized and were conducted by different institutions in Taiwan. And Taiwan scholars also gave up the pejorative name of bandit studies and turned to use the names of mainland China studies and especially contemporary China studies after 2000, given the rise of consciousness of Taiwan. These significant changes also prompted the emergence of new revolutionary history in Taiwan's context. Next slide. And one of the bold voices in the 2000s was from Huang Jingling, a sociologist at Tanhai University who critically reflected on the Nationalist Party's political discourse of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary as symbolic violence to exert political purge over the communists in 1927. He also applied Foucauldian approach, body politics, to reflect on the Chinese Communist Revolution with compassionate eyes. In his book, Polity and Body, he started from Karl Marx's goodwill of emancipating human and examined how the body control of the Communist Revolution, specifically during the period of China's Soviet Republic, compromised or destroyed this goodwill of emancipation. He argues that this revolutionary means of body control failed to let human return to human after the revolution ends. And he's also bold in reflecting on the body politics of the Nationalist Party in his History, Body and State, and review the military discipline and training of citizens during the Republican period. Next slide. At the same time, scholars at Academia Sinica also devoted themselves to this field after being marginalized for many years during the Cold War period because of their relatively neutral standpoints. And the cross-strait research colleague led by Chen Yongfar started the very first systematic research of the Communist Revolution during this period, but their motivation had been moved far away from political use, but to critically reflect on the different fates of China and Taiwan since the Cold War period and how the two Leninist parties had shaped the different futures of these two regions. The strong idea of the other China dramatically declined since historians of Taiwan were more willing to examine China and Taiwan as two different regions instead of asking for political recognition of the liberal China. This research goal is still held by scholars at Academia Sinica today, and this research colleague still exists and led by another scholar, Yu Mingling. Next slide. So overall, I argue that the other way to interpret the new revolutionary history is to go beyond the smaller climate of China's reform, but to examine it under the bigger framework of the Cold War and think about how the fall of communism in a global context has prompted Sinophone scholars' collective re-examination of the revolution. So for the future of the mapping work, We hope that definition of revolution is also not limited to the communist one, and we can turn to the nationalist revolution to see how the Taiwanese scholars reflect on this revolution that has a closer tie to themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Nathan Gunn, who is a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia.
Thank you, Chair. And it is really my pleasure to report on the translation work I've been done so far. Next slide, please. So in my presentation today, I would like to first briefly introduce an article I've been translating in collaboration with Dr. Dieter Lechner, who is a scholar of Chinese literature. And I would then go on to share some of my thoughts on the historiographical significance of the article. And the key word of my presentation is, as you have already seen from the cover slide, emotional history. Next slide. So the article I've been working on is a rather new essay written by historian Huang Daoxuan, who is a professor at Peking University in Beijing. The article focuses on the so-called Yan'an rectification movement of the early 1940s, which was a famous political campaign in the revolutionary history of the Chinese Communist Party. Huang Daoxuan's discussions is mainly about how rank and file communists of the day underwent the rectification campaign. What is rather interesting to me is that Huang gives particular attention to the emotional experiences of individual communists. So in a sense, the article is a kind of emotional history of the Yan'an rectification. I want to transition at this point to the historiographical significance of the article. Next slide, please. Even before I set out to translate it, I had already believed that it would not require too much effort to explain to our future Anglophone readers why we should translate the article. I thought it was quite obvious that Huang's article could fit well into the category known as the history of emotions in the English word. Huang himself classifies the article as a work on what he calls 心灵史, which literally means the history of hearts and souls. When I first came across the term 心灵史, my gut feelings told me that it was exactly an equivalent of the term history of emotions. If I'm correct, then it will be rather easy to defend the merits of the article as well as our translation. This is because after all, the Anglophone literature on emotions has been burgeoning in the past few decades, and anyone interested in the history of emotions may find the article to be fun and useful. But my equation of 心灵史 with the history of emotions would probably not find resonance with Huang Daoxuan himself. In a more recent article published online, Huang argues that 心灵史 is something more than the history of emotions. He defines 心灵史 as an in-between field that occupies a liminal position between the intellectual history and the history of emotions. His rejection of any equation of 心灵史 and the history of emotions is premised on an assumption that the history of emotion as a phrase does not have a connotation of reasoning. At the same time, Huang argues that it would be wrong to take 心灵史 as a field that privileges reason over emotions. He believes that human emotions are among the important active causes of history and thus are not dismissible. So based on Huang Daoxuan's ideas about 心灵史, I would argue from an ethic perspective that what Huang means by 心灵史 is indeed almost equivalent to what is known as the history of emotions in the Anglophone world. Both Huang Daoxuan and many Anglophone scholars assume that they are working on something that is not irrational, but at the same time irreducible to reason. In other words, something that does not fit into a rigid dichotomy between emotion and the reason. That something refers to emotions in the Anglophone world, and in Huang's discussion, the very something refers to 心灵 or the hearts and souls. Furthermore, in terms of research focus, both Huang and many Anglophone historians of emotions are mostly interested in the question of how particular social norms and political status quo both constructed and constrained individuals' expression of emotions. In this light, the concepts of emotional regime and emotional community, one proposed by historian William Reddy and the other by medievalist Barbara Rosa, should find welcome resonance with Huang. Indeed, what Huang tries to do in his article is to explain how the communist polity in Iran evolved into an emotional regime and how the communist cadre as a whole transformed into a divided emotional community. Of course, just like many English works on the history of emotions, the ultimate goal of Huang's research is not to explore the dynamics of human emotions. For Huang Daoxuan, the larger topic or the more weighted topic is something other than the human emotions. That larger topics could be the politics of power, the power of individuality, the significance of ego, and of course, he positions those larger and weighty topics in a very concrete historic context, that is the Iran ratification and in general, the Chinese Communist Revolution. Huang is definitely not the first nor or the only scholar of the Chinese communism who takes emotional history seriously. Over the past few decades, some Anglophone scholars, including Elizabeth Perry at Harvard and our own Timothy Chick, have already explored the roles of emotions in relation to the Chinese Communist Revolution. The recent English scholarship is mostly concerned with the dynamics of what Elizabeth Perry calls emotion work. I would say Huang Daoxuan's article, it represents a remote sinophone echo of what may be called an emotion term in the English literature on the Chinese Communist Revolution. To conclude my presentation, I would like to retell an anecdote that Huang Daoxuan recently recounted. A few years ago, some of his colleagues in China ridiculed his interest in writing about emotions. To those who mocked him, writing a history of emotions is like performing a shamanic dance, that is to do something ludicrous and meaningless. That anecdote should suffice to tell that it will probably take a rather long time for the history of emotions to secure a foothold in Chinese academia. But I do hope optimism of the burgeoning of an emotional history of Chinese communism in both Anglophone and Sinophone worlds in the near future. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Sean James, who is an MA candidate at the University of British Columbia.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to take part in this panel and present a brief summary of the article by Feng Xiaocai that my co-translator Wen Jie and I are just completing, as well as a preview of an article by Wang Xingsheng I will be translating with my colleague Kevin Yang of Shandong University. In Status, Ritual, and Politics, the Chinese Communist Party's ideological remolding of capitalists after 1956, Feng argues that the ideological remolding of former capitalists, unlike that of intellectuals, was a ritualized process. The authorities were less concerned with their inner commitments than with their public political declarations. The labeling of former industrialists and merchants as capitalist elements, despite their property having been mostly expropriated, served political ends. The CCP cadre were not concerned with changing the former capitalists' minds, but with ensuring their submission to state authority and cooperation in economic management and development. At the same time, the bourgeois elements who underwent remolding understood that their performance during remolding was directly related to their future destinies. What mattered was not the sincerity of their performance, but the extent of their willingness to publicly humiliate themselves and defer to authority. Feng presents a variety of former capitalists' responses up to the remolding process, their common objective being to minimize hardship and get it over with. Next slide, please. Some passively resisted, but most unenthusiastically went through the motions of study and self-criticism. However, even the most contrite confessions could not easily lead to a change in status from former capitalist to socialist intelligentsia or proletarian. The continuation of the bourgeois element status was economically and politically valuable to the regime, even worth the expense of maintaining a fixed interest payments to former owners of enterprises. In 1958, Mao intervened to quash attempts to expedite the ideological remolding of bourgeois elements. Feng asks himself, why was Mao Zedong so interested in preserving a capitalist class? He replies, it is likely directly related to his thinking on inter-party power struggles. If the bourgeoisie were eliminated, then all talk of inter-party capitalist roaders would be out of the question. Next slide. Following the collapse of the Great Leap Forward, the economic benefit of maintaining and redefining the status of bourgeois element through ritualized ideological education would be overshadowed by the political utility of labeling Mao's more moderate political rivals as representatives of the bourgeoisie. In both cases, Feng emphasizes the pragmatic over the purely ideological purposes of ideological remolding, providing a new rational interpretation of the ideological remolding of bourgeois elements. Next slide, please. My first 2 months in this project were spent researching recent Chinese scholarship to find articles to propose to the group for translation. The specific area in which I'm interested, the Trotskyist opposition within the Chinese Communist movement, remains a delicate subject in China and consequently one relatively lacking in Chinese language scholarship. A footnote in the 1952 edition of Mao's selected works lovingly describes the Trotskyists as a gang of assassins, saboteurs, spies, agents, and murderers without principles, a gang of deadly enemies of the proletariat, employed and used by foreign intelligence organs. By 1991, the valuation of Trotsky had been revised. One footnote now reading, Trotsky served as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Commission after the victory of the October Revolution. In November 1927, he was liquidated from the party. In the international communist movement, Trotsky had conducted many splitting and sabotage activities. The first major scholarly Chinese language work on the Chinese Trotskyists was Tang Baolin's 1994 Zhongguo Tuo Pai Shi. Although this work dropped the traditional slanders of the Trotskyists as agents of Hitler and the Japanese, it did follow the official valuation, maintaining many of the traditional Stalinist falsehoods concerning Trotsky's positions on international revolution, the peasantry, their attitude towards the anti-Japanese war of resistance, and towards the Civil War. Most articles on the Chinese Trotskyists seek to explain how they strayed from the correct line represented by Mao Zedong. Next slide, please. Of the articles published in the People's Republic of China between 1995 to 2020, we have not found many that do not propagate some falsehoods, although there are promising dissertations making use of newly accessible archives. There are certainly more that we have not located, but we have made a start in mapping the field of PRC research on Chinese Trotskyism. If you come across any articles, please let me know. My colleague Kevin Young and I plan to translate an article by Wang Xingsheng, a researcher with the Central Party History Research Bureau on the Communist International and the anti-Trotskyite campaign in China during the war against Japanese aggression. Next slide. Wang discusses the origin and causes of the anti-Trotskyite campaigns and the Comintern's role in promoting these political purges in the Chinese party during the Sino-Japanese War. Wang shows that in contrast to the Soviets, the Chinese communists, including Mao Zedong, regarded the Trotskyists as potential allies in the war against Japan, inviting them to join in a united front against Japanese aggression and courting the CC founder Chen Duzhou to rejoin them. However, as Stalin launched the Moscow trials, he directed the international communist movement to destroy the parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyite centers. In China, after many communists sympathized with Zhang Xueliang's kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek, Wang Ming and Kang Sheng were sent back to purge Trotskyite sympathizers and solidify the renewed CCP-KMT United Front. Thereafter, the Trotskyists were treated no differently from the Japanese invaders. According to Wang Xingsheng, the CCP's anti-Trotskyite campaign was, unlike the Soviet Union's, directed less toward party members than toward external foes. Both the Trotskyists, along with many CCP members and the hardline anti-communists of the KMT, opposed the establishment of the Second United Front, the Trotskyists accusing the CCP of selling out to the revolution to the Kuomintang right wing opposing any concessions to the communists. Wang argues that the CCP, rather than carrying out an internal purge, initially made use of the mandatory anti-Trotskyite campaign to label all opponents of the Second United Front as Trotskyites. However, the Comintern insisted that all national parties carry out internal purges. Wang suggests that these internal anti-Trotskyite purges, as well as the failure to win back Chengdu, produced widespread distrust of Wang Ming among CCP leaders and members, and led to the defection of Zhang Guotao and ascendance of Mao Zedong. Although Wang suggests that the anti-Trotskyite campaign did not damage the CCP as much as it did the CPSU, he highlights the effects of this campaign on the subsequent development of the CCP, in particular, the unintended consequence of its increasing independence from Soviet control under the leadership of Mao Zedong. We look forward to making these articles available to English language readers. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Jiaqi Yao, who is a PhD candidate in Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia.
Okay. I would like to thank audience and my fellow panelists for the opportunity to present our mapping and translations of critical socialist feminist scholarship in China, as well as Morgan Rocks, who co-translated Dong Liming's Yan'an experience with a previous participant and translated with me Song Shaopen's Gender and Class in the Soviet Area Women's Movement. Next slide, please. Our primary guidance comes from Nicola Spakowski's 2017 article, Socialist Feminism in Post-Socialist China. She identifies the group of scholars and, more importantly, contextualizes the importance of their work in Chinese and feminist studies. Per Spakowski's overview, the goal of socialist feminists is not simply to respond to Western feminist perspectives and critique their close relation to capitalism, but also to re-evaluate women's liberation from the perspective of gender in China's socialist past under Marxist framework as a revision and addition to pre-existing state-dominated revolutionary histories, which usually take class as the exclusive category of analysis. She keenly observes their visible yet marginal status in the field of Chinese feminism and revolutionary history as of 2017. Our own reading contends that studies by socialist feminists shed new light on gender issues in current post-socialist reality. Many issues present now in Chinese society trace back to Communist Party policymaking in the Republican era. Next slide, please. While Spakowski draws a theoretical roadmap of critical socialist feminism, we aim to first use her article to outline these scholars' concrete social networks, then profile their post-2017 works, and choose representative pieces for translation. Next slide, please. Spakowski's article lists names, conferences, and important references that we went through to trace networks. It is not surprising that this cluster of socialist feminists is highly transnational. Scholars from the PRC, along with peers from American and European institutions, have all participated enthusiastically in conferences and publications. And as Spakowski points out, Western scholarship and Western left-wing feminism feed into the group. Yet this thriving transnational research cluster remains primarily among Chinese-speaking academic circles with a primarily PRC-based audience. Here is an example list of participants of the 2017 conference: Women and the Chinese Revolution, Continuation and Change, co-organized by Renmin University's Marxist School and Collection of Women's Studies. From this list of participants, we can see a synergy between the Socialist Feminists and the Women's Federation, which actively collaborated with universities, especially in Beijing, and whose journal Collection of Women's Studies serves as a major publishing outlet. Next slide. Further, possible connections between socialist feminist scholarship and new revolutionary history are implied in Professor Yingxing's keynote speech at the 2017 conference and Dong Liming's 2019 essay, New Revolutionary History, How It Could Be Possible to Reconstruct the Narrative of Revolutionary History. Both hope new revolutionary history can incorporate multi-level analysis and interdisciplinary methodologies and develop a new holistic 总体性 research paradigm. Next slide, please. While I cannot speak to Morgan's direct experience in translating Dong Liming's Yan'an experience, the issue he and his partner faced in her article centered on the particular ways she used historical terms, such as 妇女主义 and 家庭统一战线, to illustrate the messy processes by which the CCP understood and codified its approach to women's liberation. In a similar vein, Song Shaopeng foregrounded the definitions employed similarly ample use of historical terminology. In translating Song, our workflow was complementary. As a native English speaker, Morgan handled most of the initial translation, with me doing initial translation for the concluding sections. For Morgan's translation, I would revise paragraphs and work on some research of specific terms or quotations that use local dialect, with an ear for more figurative aspects of the language and Song's writing style. We found the collaborative translation process especially useful for decoding and comparing English and Chinese language academic styles, and enjoy the process of going from literal to literate by presenting our work to our lab mates and asking their takes on our particular problems. Next slide. Overall, we focused on selecting socialist feminist scholars within our MAP network who look to history, specifically the pre-1949 period, for theoretical resources. But in so doing, we stumbled across a congruent group of scholars, mainly from non-elite institutions, who examine CCP gender and marriage policies from a non-socialist feminist perspective. We feel the scholarship and the positionality of this group can further help contextualize the socialist feminists and their position within Chinese academia. The articles here all discuss regulation of sexual relations in the base areas in the context of revolutionary history and rural history in China. These male historians, mostly from regional universities, do not share the socialist feminist mode of analysis and are more empiricist in methodology. One of our plans is to find an appropriate angle to compare these regional scholars' works and the socialist feminist works. Next slide, please. We also envision a digital humanities project to visualize these socialist feminist networks and to measure their connections to various research fields, disciplines, journals, institutions, organizations, conferences, and even keywords. The data and visualized outcome would help us to better understand this transnational academic network scholars have established and are developing. The project could explore the strengths of working relationships, centers of socialist feminist scholarship, publication outlets, and the relationship socialist feminist scholars have with other subsections of Chinese academia. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts about this really crucial and very cool work that they're doing. when I first learned about this project, one of my first thoughts was how kind of transformative this was going to be for my teaching, you know, for undergraduates and graduate students who don't read Chinese or are still working on the language, to be able to read and engage with all of this Chinese language scholarship. And of course, what you're doing is also really relevant and helpful for those who can read Chinese, because your expertise in history and Chinese studies has led you to some very insightful analyses of the literature. And while you were all talking, I was thinking about ways to get even more of these kinds of collaborative translations going. I know that Professors Cheek, Ownby, and Fogel plan to continue organizing similar efforts, but in addition to what they're doing, and if they would give us their blessing, of course, I was thinking that it could be really good for graduate students and junior faculty to create similar pairs to translate their own work for publication, and even co-write something in 2 languages. And that way, you know, if there isn't enough funding to cover everything we'd like to see in translation, or there aren't enough you know, pages in an edited volume to publish everything, that people, authors and translators, could still work together so that each of them gets, you know, a foreign language publication as well as a translation credit on their CV and a much broader audience. And this would further the extent to which the 2 historiographies could engage with one another. And I know that we at the PRC History Review would be delighted to publish some of these kinds of things, and even to help forge some of these partnerships if younger scholars wanted to do this kind of thing, but didn't know, you know, who to work with. We could try to pair people with similar interests. So if people are interested in that kind of thing, I'd love to hear more about, you know, your plans and how the PRC History Group could help you with those. And I have lots of other thoughts about your project and about your individual pieces, but I'd rather leave time for you to say a bit more. So I'll just pose a few questions to you and then turn things back over to our speakers. So first of all, for Yifan Shi and for Manan, I have kind of a similar couple of questions for you on this idea of the new revolutionary history, which really resonates with the grassroots histories of Maoism in Anglophone scholarship. And I'm wondering, you know, if you see ways that those 2 kind of similar fields could engage more productively with one another than they are now, kind of thinking about, you know, where are they doing similar things, where are they doing different things? And then also about the new revolutionary history in Chinese, I'm wondering about this relationship, if you could say a bit more about the relationship between the old revolutionary history and the new. I understand that, you know, people are kind of viewing the old revolutionary history as, you know, more kind of state propaganda, and that the kind of grassroots daily life experiences is more exciting. And I think it's really exciting too. But I wonder but then you also said it's not a total paradigm shift, right? Those things are still interacting with one another. And I wonder to what extent that grassroots history kind of speaks to that older history and vice versa. So I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about that. Wenjie, the idea of weakening the divide between historiographies by thinking about Taiwanese scholarship on the revolution as part of new revolutionary history is really insightful, as is the argument for thinking about the Cold War and the end of the Cold War for broader context. And I wonder, and you might not, but I just wonder whether you have any sense of the most recent scholarship from Taiwan and whether it's changing again as we've moved towards a kind of global, I don't know if repoliticization is the right word, but another moment of kind of overt politicization of language and discourse in China, in the US, certainly in Taiwan to a certain extent, and moving towards what some people are calling a new Cold War, when connections between the US, China, Taiwan, communism, capitalism, and liberal democracy are at the forefront of the conversation again. For Nathan, this concept of Xiling Shi and the question of whether it's, or what its relationship is to the history of emotions, to what people call the history of emotions, is really interesting. And it gets at one of the things that's so exciting about this project, which is the way that it fosters these kinds of conversations. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the the connections between emotion and reason, because you were sort of talking about the way that this is not seen as, it's not illogical, right? But it's precisely not logical. And both historiographies seem to, have this sense that there's almost this kind of alternate epistemology going on here. And I'm sort of interested in hearing you say a little bit more about how Huang's analysis, for example, might, I don't know, clarify or complicate the way that the Anglophone scholarship is trying to imagine, what's happening in the realm of emotions and how this connects to knowledge production. Sean, there's so much great stuff in your presentation, and you, like all the panelists, actually should feel free to talk about whatever you want during your follow-up comments. But I have a question about the Trotskyists, because it seems like you're really interested in them, and I am too. And I wonder, I get the sense, right, and this is something that seems to be in the scholarship that you're talking about too, that sometimes when people use Trotskyists, they have something specific in mind, which connects to people maybe who have positions that are similar to Trotsky's, and other times it just seems to be kind of a general, slur that you can use against somebody. But I wonder, actually, even though that's how it seems, if that's really true. I generally find that even when we get that impression, when we really start mapping the discourses, we find that it isn't actually something you can use in any way that you want, right? That these things do have precise, if kind of unexpected meanings. And I wonder whether you've seen anything in the scholarship yet that gives you a better sort of taxonomy or explanation of what it might mean, and whether there is actually a logic there, even when it seems more random. And then finally, Jiaqi, you gave a really rich and fascinating look at this socialist feminist scholarship, and it really demonstrated how Chinese scholarship can pose productive challenges to us and to Anglophone scholarship, and feminist theory and women's studies are a really excellent example of that. And one of the things I was really interested in was this idea of terms, right, and how you're thinking about these translations, and yes, that you acknowledging how difficult it is to think about how to translate some of these terms. I mean, I was thinking about something like "funujuyi," which I know it wasn't you, but this idea of translating this as womanism or woman-centered, and I'm really interested in that, because every time you translate these terms, they then also have these like textual histories in Anglophone feminist theory, which are not the same thing and which are complicated, but which of course are going to inform the way people read that. And so I was wondering kind of if you thought about that, and whether that was going to allow you to contribute to or challenge some of the knowledge being produced in Western feminist theory, through these words and these textual histories. So I will stop there and turn it back over to all of you to respond in the order in which you initially spoke.
So I think I should respond first. Thank you, Professor Smith, for your questions about the relationship between old and new revolutionary histories. I think I can respond to this question very briefly. I think we can approach this question in two ways. First, I think, as Lili Feng and other scholars have pointed out, old revolutionary history are usually used for political propaganda to justify the ruling position of the CCP. So that is usually called the revolutionary narrative in Chinese, 革命史观. And those do not follow this revolutionary narrative might be labeled as historical nihilism, 历史虚无主义 in mainland China. And the new revolutionary history, on the other hand, are academic oriented in the sense that they follow the rules of historical research, which means that they use primary sources, including documents or archival sources or oral history materials, and they may not follow the conclusions of the official revolutionary narrative. So that is the first difference between old and new revolutionary history. And I think Another way to approach this question is to look at the methods or the perspective they are following. So the old revolutionary history, not all of the old revolutionary history are for propaganda purposes. One example I think is Shen Zhihua's articles. I have found that Shen Zhihua's article didn't appear on the list of recommended essays provided by 7 Chinese scholars, not because Shen Zhihua's articles are for propaganda purposes, but because his articles are basically using some old methods. So Shen Zhihua is using some archival documents to study some high politics during the Cold War period. So although he has made huge progress in the studies of Cold War history, but we usually don't consider his studies as a part of new revolutionary history. And on the contrary, as I have said in my presentation, new revolutionary history usually adopts some new methods to incorporate some new perspectives into the studies of the Chinese Revolution, such as a new cultural history or history of emotions. So that's why Jonathan and I chose to translate Li Gongzhong's article about the Sun Yat-sen mausoleum first, because he actively engaged with previous studies on new cultural history, including the work of Henrietta Harrison on the making of a Republican citizen. Yeah, I think I can stop here and leave this question to Manan.
Okay, thanks, Shifan. Talking about the new revolution history, we have to face the old revolutionary history. So what is the old revolutionary history? Well, the famous proposition put forward was by Hu Shen, the former director of CBC History Research Office. His idea is there has 3 revolutionary high tides, 所谓3次革命高潮. Of course, these 3 revolutionary high tides was propaganda, political propaganda. But recently, very famous professor Luo Zhitian in Sichuan University, he thinks behind the 3 revolutionary high tides, there is China-centered approach. So although it's political propaganda, the old revolutionary history also has different, also somewhat methods about how we can do history in academic track. But when we talk about the new revolution history, I agree with Shi Yifan's ideas. Yes, the new generation, especially who born in 1980s and 1990s, they can treat the revolution with an ordinary mind. They don't think revolution is propaganda system. They don't believe the myth of revolution. They can restore the daily logic and the normal behaviors of figures, groups, and common people. I think this is very important contribution of this group of the so-called the new revolutionary history. So I and Matt, we choose a paper of Yingxin. Yingxin is a very famous figure who influenced the new generation, and he used sociological and anthropological methods to study a Chinese revolution. This is very important behavior in Chinese modern history circle. That's my idea. Thanks.
Okay, so, thank you for Professor Smith's question. I think it's very helpful for me to follow the next trend of Taiwanese scholarship. I think it's definitely an interesting question to see that how the scholarship are changing in tandem with the new changes in the international relations, and that's why I think I need to like correlate new revolutionary history to the Cold War climate, because the changing of international environment always direct people's view or review to the communist parts of communist revolution. And and for the latest trend in the Taiwanese academia, I think I need to mention Chen Yaohuang Scholarship, who was probably one of the youngest historians now doing research in academia Sinica. And I think the issues are reflected by Chen Yaohuang's scholarship when I was examining Chen Yaohuang's scholarship is going to be faced by all the Taiwanese scholars in who is majoring communist revolution in the following decades, because it's very apparent that they are facing a very serious problem of having no access to mainland China's archives. And Chen Yaohuang's previous book, which was published in 2012, was about the CCP's North China organization, the revolution that happened during the 1940s. And he used a lot of research data and also profiles and also many reports generated by Japanese army at that time. So it seems that his research also need to cross over this huge problem of having no access and probably having no personal chances of doing field work in China. And I think in the next following decade of the Cold War, this gonna be an issue that faced by Taiwanese scholar as a whole. And I think I also need to keep an eye to see that how they are going to tackle with this new issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for the comments and the two exciting questions. And I have to confess that it would be really hard for me to explain the kind of complicated relationship between reason and emotion as not kind of analytical or descriptive concepts, but as the real or objective totalities. So like the relationship between emotions as a kind of entities and reason as a totality like have been explored by many scholars, especially natural scientists as well as psychologists. It is not surprising that the kind of first influential historian who argued that there is no clear boundaries. There are no clear boundaries between emotion and reason is William Randi, who got some really well training in psychology. So probably as historians, so we would just leave the complicated intertwinement of emotion and the reason to natural scientists and psychologists. But I think what really mattered for historians, I mean, the blurring of lines between emotions and reason, is that blurring of boundaries really invites our attention to some previously untold stories about human, especially the grassroots figures as the kind of modern population you mentioned in your commentaries about Yifan's and Manan's presentations. And we know that from many classic works, including E.P. Thompson's work on the British working class and Robert Dalton's work on the relationship of work between workers and the Great Cat Massacre, that those grassroots figures are usually voiceless in the textual materials that historians have been drawing on. So, so if we take the history or the emotions in history really seriously, it is really possible for historians to revisit some previously neglected details covered in the textual materials we have already had, like maybe a kind of fleeting mention of the cry, like some workers crying, or the occasion on which a bunch of rural women gather together and laughing at a kind of ridiculous guy. So the kind of really brief fleeting mentions of those kind of acts of expressing emotions, I think are valuable, at least for historians who care about the grassroots. So, so I think there could be kind of interesting relationship between the grassroots history and the kind of emotional term. And for the question of how Huang's article could complement the English literature on emotions, as I mentioned in my presentation, the recent English literature is mostly concerned with what Elizabeth Paris calls emotion work, that is the kind of institutionalized dynamics of emotional mobilization, or to borrow kind of terms from our own Timothy Chi, kind of a Maoist notion about how to do kind of emotional work. So so I think many Anglophone scholars are really concerned about the norms or kind of large conjectures that could shape the dynamics of emotional mobilization. And the influence of the emotional mobilization on the ground is covered by evidence is covered by Huang's article, and evidence by the cases covered in Huang's article. So that could be, that article could complement the English literature in a sense that it provides some really exciting empirical evidence of how what Elizabeth Perry identified as emotion work actually influenced the everyday life of individual communities on the ground. Thanks.
I'm delighted to hear that you're interested in the Chinese Trotskyists. I'll definitely have more to talk to you about that later. The questions you asked are really good ones. I guess what in China, so, since there were Trotskyists, I guess, until quite recently, as the footnotes said, they were spies and saboteurs, etc. But since Gaige Kaifang, there have been more serious attention into one of the questions, of course, is how did the founder of the Chinese Communist Party become a Trotskyist? How can we say that he was so brilliant and yet he fell into Trotskyism, as they say? And interestingly, since the Sino-Soviet split, they were more able to concede that actually Trotsky was right about the 1925 and 27 revolution and the United Front from within, and the Comintern was wrong. But they still say the Trotskyites were wrong to oppose Mao. They were wrong to oppose peasant-based revolution. And that the 1949 revolution has proved Mao correct. So that kind of remains the standard line by Tang Baolin, Wu Jimin, and others, but they are at least studying more seriously the roles that that Trotskyists played in pre-1949. So one of these is Zheng Chaolin, who had been in prison since 1952 and was released after 1979, somehow managed to survive all that time, and later became an important source for history. He was one of the oldest surviving participants in the first Congress. He had been a friend of Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, so he was interviewed and put on the history channels and so on in China. Actually, one of the my first translation is a couple of articles of his that he wrote in the 40s on revolution, questions of revolution, and those will be published in a volume edited by Gregor Benton this year. of course, most of the work on the Chinese Trotskyists has been done by Gregor Benton and in the West. And so there is a fairly well spelled out taxonomy of the Chinese Trotskyists. But of course, a lot of the material or archives are still in China and not accessible to us. The interesting, I guess, the Trotskyists after 1952 were pretty much all arrested or in exile. After 1932, when they just were formed, they had been arrested by the Kuomintang and remained in prison for most of the time. So they basically split into two, and they did have a majority faction led by Peng Shuzhi, who they had different questions, and then a minority by Zheng Chaolin and Wang Fangxi. The majority, for example, in the anti-Japanese War of Resistance, the majority were for revolutionary defensism, the minority for revolutionary defeatism.
Sean, I'm gonna redirect you to say a few words about some of the technical aspects of the project before we move on to Jiaqi.
Okay, so on the technical issues, I was constantly fighting with Qi Laoshi to try to get us to use document file sharing instead of email, and things like Teams or Slack for collaborative work. So I have a lot of very strong ideas on those things. If anyone wants to discuss those with me, please do contact me. My contact info is on my conference profile.
So I will be quick. I will talk about my practical experience and provide one example in Song Shaopeng's article. And since Morgan is here, I will invite Morgan to talk about his struggle with 妇女主义. So I do think terms really challenge the translator's ability. So first, we need to understand the connotation of the word and give a proper counterpart in the English. For example, I have a headache to translate all kinds of 主义. So after May 4th movement, it seems that intellectuals love to add 主义 to everything. But as a translator, we cannot attach ism to every English word. It doesn't make sense. So we need to identify whether this 主义 means a whole discourse from the West, or it's a kind of discourse generated in the Chinese context, or it's just kind of common usage, kind of usage, the intellectual use. And about how these terms could challenge the Western theories, I cannot think of an example now, but I think one argument in Song Shaopeng's article is very interesting. So she talks about CCP's policy and their definition of labor. So she mentioned that it's a kind of a theoretical creation of CCP to define women's labor, because they define like domestic works as a kind of labor. So that means that all the housewives, they certainly have their own independent identity and kind of classification as kind of labor. So they are no longer a kind of dependent to their husbands and family. I guess it's really a kind of innovative and shock for me to see like how the communists actually invented such kind of concept and kind of support kind of feminism in the 1930s and 40s. Yeah, Morgan, please.
Okay, I guess taking up with the problems we had with 妇奴主义 and Dong Limin's piece, and as Jiaqi so eloquently put this idea of 主义 and ism and how to take that. And at first, my partner Wei Sen and I, we had initially put it as womanism, but over the course of our discussion with our group members in our translation labs, we had come up with other ideas, and the idea for a women-centered approach came from Yifan, and other alternatives of just leaving it in the pinyin as sort of something that's not quite captured in English. And this led us, I guess, as part of the broader goals of the project is building these networks with other scholars and so forth. Because in the process of translating Fu Nu Zhui, taking a look at Dong Limin's footnotes, she had cited the work of Cong Xiaoping at University of Houston and her work on marriage law in Yan'an in the 1940s. And so we'd gotten in contact with her and tried to place Fu Nu Zhui in the context of the debates going on in Yan'an at the time. And so in doing that, we started seeing resonances with what Yifan had suggested in terms of a women-centered approach, that Fu Nu Zhui wasn't an ism, but sort of a line that was debated as to what work style would prevail for women's work. And so going back and forth on that. And another reason is we haven't quite settled is womanism itself is a term that is used in Western feminism, particularly as created by BIPOC feminists as a way to reclaim feminism from white middle-class feminists of mainly from that second wave of feminism and so forth. So like these very differing and intermingling and intersecting worlds of different feminisms that are captured, but also Dong Limin's larger purpose of turning to Yan'an and early CCP history as a resource for feminist theory, and larger arguments about the localization and indigenization of feminist theory within China itself, especially in response to 1980s post-reform importation of Western feminism that sort of separated gender and class. Because one of the Western theoretical resources that Dong Limin and others draw on is Nancy Fraser and her idea of needing to rejoin gender, class, and politics as a whole that is needed for feminist analysis. And that's all captured in her insistence on using Fu Nu Zhui throughout the text and not really ever defining it outside of citations. I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks everyone for just more wonderful food for thought and really fantastic answers to my questions. So maybe we can open it up for a little bit of dialogue. Do you have questions for each other? Or Tim, have you got any questions or comments you'd like to make?
I'll jump in a little. It would be too hard for me to say nothing. It's been a real pleasure to see the whole team at work. And Mindy, thank you so much for taking the time in this excellent commentary. And I just wanted to respond in particular to your suggestion about expanding the process. That doing these kind of labs, we call them, and the collaborative translation, it very much is generated in the project that David Owenby and Josh Rogel and I did on the public intellectuals. And it does not have to be limited to any topic. And I think you're absolutely right that this is the kind of thing I'd love to see, that kind of collaboration and any which way that people can make it work. And with prchistory.org, obviously ours is a topic that we'll have to have further conversations, but it's I think we're trying to showcase that this is scholarly translation as academic work and not as meat Google. Any last thoughts?
I really liked your idea of using it also as language training. I mean, that's as the one of the Laowais here, I can say that I learned a lot of Chinese through this that I did not learn in my Chinese history classes. We never studied Tuofei, for example. So there's a lot of, I mean, every sentence I translate is some kind of new word or something said in a way that I've never encountered before. So when I research, I might just read it and say whatever, I get the gist of it. But certainly when you have to translate it, you need to get more than the gist and study it a bit more in depth. So I think that would be a wonderful way to learn both Chinese history and the language.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. Does anybody have any final thoughts? Go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to build on Sean's reflection on the usefulness of collaborative translation in terms of language training. I think engaging in a translation of a kind of Chinese article into English is also not only useful for Anglophone speakers. I mean, scholars who are native speakers of English, but also younger scholars whose mother tongues are Chinese and in a broader sense, I mean, both Mandarin and other kind of Chinese dialects. And so as a native speaker of Chinese, I think it is really challenging for us to encounter kind of seemingly clear, but actually really complicated Chinese terms, such as the commonly used term 思想. It is like not uncommon that Chinese native speakers of Chinese tend to just neglect the nuance implications of that term. But when we use that term in a more academic context, or when we encounter that term in a kind of a remote historical context, I think even native speakers of Mandarin should be aware of the kind of the multiplicity of all kinds of implications that the term 思想 might connote, and to take the kind of intertwinement and also the tensions between the different kinds of implication of the same word seriously. And probably that kind of exploration, a kind of philological exploration, will be a great starting point for reflecting on some larger questions, such as the interrelationship between reason and emotion in the cases of the term 思想.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you everyone for this wonderful conversation. I hope we will continue this conversation, and we look forward to questions and comments from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.